Good afternoon. I invite you to take your seats. And it's my great privilege to introduce our next speaker. I also think we're pretty lucky because the after lunch slot is a tough one. Because either you're starting to get a little sleepy, or you're in a rush to get back and all the rest and get set up. It's a tough slot to have, but Bruce Kuklick is about the best person imaginable for an after-lunch speaker slot. He is legendary at the University of Pennsylvania, absolutely legendary as an entertaining lecturer, mostly deserved. He's won just about he's won just about every teaching award at the University of Pennsylvania. And is currently the Nichols Professor of American History Emeritus. Sadly, Bruce retired from Penn recently, and it's a loss that literally cannot be made good. They don't make them like him anymore. That's all there is to it. And the surprising thing is he's a native Philadelphian. I mean, he's born and bred and educated here in the city, public school product. He took his BA, his MA, and PhD all from Penn. And then after a few years in the wilderness up in New Haven, Connecticut, he was hired back by Penn and has been a professor at the University of Pennsylvania ever since. I say they don't make them like him anymore. I mean that. He is not only a brilliant intellectual historian. I say brilliant, not that I'm qualified to judge. I mean, intellectual history is way up here. As far as I'm concerned, but he is also a brilliant political and diplomatic historian, which is a very rare combination indeed. He has written all kinds of books: The Rise of American Philosophy, Philosophy in America, Churchmen and Philosophers, from Jonathan Edwards to John Dewey. Amazing. You'd think that someone who is so involved with the great intellectual figures in American history wouldn't stoop to writing books about, for instance, Shibe Park here in Philadelphia, the great baseball stadium, or for that matter, Blind Oracles, Intellectuals and War from Kennan to Kissinger. And most recently, he's written a textbook, finally got around to doing one, called One Nation Under God, a magnificent political history of the United States. And he's currently at work on a history of the assassination of Patrice Lumumba. Those of us of a certain age remember the controversy over the independence of the Congo and the murder of that charismatic leader in 1961, in which the United States probably had something to do. As part of the Cold War. And let me just add that Kuklick he's been honored all over the place. He's been a fellow at the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford. He's been elected to the American Philosophical Society. He's taught all over Europe as well as in the United States. And we're very, very fortunate to have him here this afternoon. Bruce Kuklick.
Normally people exaggerate when they introduce me, but this very modest and low-key introduction of Wally's, it's just about on target.
Well, I didn't mention his greatest contribution to Penn, which was he persuaded me to come there.
My job today is to talk about Philadelphia's centrality in the intellectual life of the colonies in the 18th century. And as I'm sure all you know, this is a very old chestnut. And I've provided you in that heap of stuff you've got with you a little outline of what I'm going to say, so you don't even have to, I don't think you have to take any notes on it. But I do have one rule, and that's this. This is not an AP history course. It's not a college lecture. And if you disagree with me, if you want to add something, if you just want me to clarify something, please raise your hand, or don't even raise your hand, just yell it out. From what I've been here all morning, and I think basically you're too well behaved. So feel free. Philadelphia's centrality in the commercial life of the colonies, I think, is guaranteed by the fact that Philadelphia has this enormous port on the Delaware, which gives it entree into the American backcountry. Its political centrality in the 18th century is guaranteed, I think, by its geographic centrality. Its intellectual life is paramount because of the interest of its citizens in the dominant paradigm of intellectual life, which I call applied natural philosophy. And I want to define that term through a series of examples. John and William Bartram are a father and son who go up and down the east coast of North America collecting seeds from plants, actual plant specimens themselves, and also animal specimens, zoological specimens. And they create the oldest extant public and commercial garden in North America. It's still around today, Bartram's Gardens. It's maybe 15 minutes from here by car in the Southwest on the Schuylkill, still thriving, owned by the city of Philadelphia. The Bartrams, in creating their garden, make contributions to botany, to horticulture, and gardening. They also make a good living from what they do, because what they do is sell the seeds and sometimes the live plants themselves to Europeans. These things are sent across the ocean on ships, and then they're used by Europeans who are interested in species native to Europe and not to America, and vice versa. People are interested in cross-pollinating plants and in creating their own North American gardens.
Would you say that this is some sort of a small Columbian exchange? Is that what you're talking about?
That would be, I think, a kind of more or less negative way of putting it, because, well, this is parenthetical. One of the reasons I start with Bartram's Gardens is that my kid is a landscape architect who's there. And all I hear day and night is about invasive species. And that is exactly what the Bartrams are doing. So, yes, but we didn't think about invasive species then. Okay. That's what I would say. Second, David Rittenhouse is a tinkerer and craftsman who builds mechanical scale models of the solar system. They're called the Rittenhouse orreries. And he sells one to the College of New Jersey, later Princeton University, sells another to the College of Philadelphia, later the University of Pennsylvania. With a telescope that he's made, he and a team of guys in 1769 chart the transit of Venus, that is, the passage of Venus between the Earth and the Sun. And they share this information with astronomers in Europe. And Rittenhouse's work, first of all, contributes to surveying in the New World, which is an incredibly significant area of specialization, which helps impose European ideas of property over against the notions of land use held by the Native Americans. He also makes contributions through his work to maritime navigation, which again is a critical part of the growth of the Atlantic world in the 18th century. Benjamin Rush is a doctor trained in Scotland, who was the first professor of chemistry at the College of Philadelphia, and then is also associated with the first hospital established in the colonies, the Pennsylvania Hospital. And this hospital had what we would now call a very, very large mental ward. And sometimes Rush is called, although I only found this out when I looked him up on Wikipedia. Always use Wikipedia. That's what it's a professor, that's great. He's called the father of American psychiatry. And basically what he likes to do is to look at similar mental illnesses at different stages of their development, or different mental illnesses at the same stage of their development, and from his categorizing observational work to try to figure out some way to intervene to help these, poor wretches in the 18th century, basically in what I would call insane asylums. That's Rush. Now, I hope at this point you're saying, when's this guy going to mention Ben Franklin? And certainly insofar as what I would call strictly scientific work goes, because of what he did with electricity, Franklin is one of these people who is ranked with the scientist of Europe. He's often talked about in the same category as Isaac Newton, although Franklin himself does this because he wants to put lightning rods on the houses in Philly, and also because he's interested in building electric condensers, the predecessor of electric batteries. I rather think of Franklin as the chief information officer among this group of people. He was, as you know, a printer and publisher, and one of his main ideas is basically, how can we get the word out to a wider public about all this stuff that's going on, and how can this wider public take it in some way and make whatever use it wants to improve the lives of these people out there who are getting his publications. In addition to that, Franklin is the guy who is the founder in North America of the book club or the book discussion group, because that's effectively what the library company and the American Philosophical Society are. Franklin's idea is that you get all these interested intellectuals around a fire sitting in chairs, and they talk to one another, cooperate, cross-fertilize, kind of advance one another's projects through conversation. And then finally, as the chief information officer, he is, as I think you know, the founder of the College of Philadelphia. And there's a great couple of letters when he is involved in the organizational work of establishing the college, letters that he writes to his book dealers in London and Paris. And he says, for my college, buy me the works of all the great European scholars, except don't buy divinity. And the standard view is that what distinguishes the College of Philadelphia is that it is not a ministerial training college like all of the other institutions. They teach the standard classical curriculum, Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. The College of Philadelphia is going to teach more practical subjects, which I look at as kind of beefed up equivalents of reading, writing, and arithmetic. Now, the actual truth is more complex. There's a fight at the College of Philadelphia over a whole series of years between people like Franklin, who are interested in pushing for more practical utilitarian instruction, and the people who are interested in the classical curriculum. But it's still the case that the College of Philadelphia tilts away from doctrinal Protestant aspects of education and leans more in the direction of what I would call progressive, practical Enlightenment ideas. So there's Franklin as the chief information officer. Finally, the guy who was iconic for me is someone whom I came in too late for Wally's talk to hear what exactly he said about Charles Wilson Peel. Peel and his sons were very prominent artists in the colonial and early national periods. But Peale is much more than an artist. At the end of the 18th century, he opened a museum in Philadelphia, which occupied a couple of rooms of Independence Hall. And in 1820, when he was quite old, he did a self-portrait of Peale at his museum. And if I were any better with all of this fancy PowerPoint stuff, I would show you this, but I'm just going to dramatize it. He's there like this, and he's pushing open the curtain which separates the museum from the rest of Independence Hall and beckoning the viewer into the museum. And you can see some of the things in the museum in the background. Now, if you find out what this museum is about, for me, it's a bunch of junk. It's collectibles, sort of stuff you would find at a tag sale. They're mastodon bones. They're stuffed animals. They are drawings of plants and animals. And then there are a lot of paintings of American political luminaries. And the idea is basically, from Peale's point of view, to show to the world all of these extraordinary things that North America, the British colonies, have that no one else has. Look at this stuff that we have that's so new, innovative, original, that's ours, and that puts us on display in front of the world. Now, Philadelphia's lead in applied natural philosophy is so overwhelming, so extraordinary, so incredible at the end of the 18th century that when I was preparing this talk, the question forced itself on my mind. What happened? How did we lose out? How did Philadelphia go downhill? It's quite easy for me to explain why New York overtakes Philadelphia as a commercial center. Demographics. New York comes to have a far greater population than Philadelphia of similarly talented and skilled people, and Philadelphia finally runs to become the second city in commerce and business finance in relation to New York. It's also easy to explain why Philadelphia loses its political dominance. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison do a deal with Alexander Hamilton in the early 1790s. They want the capital moved south. He wants a stronger fiscal and financial power given to the national government. They do the deal. The capital moves ultimately to Washington, D.C. Philadelphia is no longer the political center. But what on earth in the 19th century allows Philadelphia to give way to Boston as the nation's intellectual capital? Boston in the 18th century is a one-dimensional religious center. And all of us, and not, well, it is all of a sudden in historical terms, within 50 years, it dominates Philadelphia. And what I want to do with the rest of this talk is to do something much more speculative and interpretive than just listing a bunch of natural philosophers, which is try to answer that question. And this is as I said, a speculative and interpretive enterprise. And it takes us a little away from this question that, did it happen in Philadelphia by accident, which strikes me as a McDougall question. Is it, Wally? No. Oh, okay. Well, whosever question is, I don't think that's very interesting. And you'll see see the connection of what I'm trying to do with that. But they didn't tell me that I had to contribute to this. They told me that I had to talk about intellectual life in Philadelphia, and I can still, so I'm under that rubric. To answer this speculative and interpretive question, what I want to do for you is to sketch the wider cultural life of Pennsylvania and Philadelphia on the one hand in the 18th, 19th century, as opposed to Boston, Massachusetts, and New England at the same time. what is fundamental to me, for me, about the culture of Philadelphia and Pennsylvania is Quaker spirituality. What you want to know, and I think I'm just going to re-emphasize things that Professor Tully has talked about with more expertise and at greater length. What is crucial for the Quakers is the fundamental transaction between the creator and an individual. There's a transcendent commerce that goes on between peoples and their God that is what is basic to spirituality and religiosity. It's fundamental. It's something that can't be questioned. It's just there. It's the basic experiential kind of connection that makes for what's going on for Quakers and what makes its impact across Philadelphia and Pennsylvania. It means, in some fundamental way, that in the context of the 18th century, the Quakers are more tolerant than other religious groups. We can't judge these other people, and so the Quakers invite into the colony all of these odd groups from northwestern Europe who come to populate the back country. And the Quakers' ideas about admitting these people to their colony is confirmed, corroborated by the fact that these people in the New World become pious, God-fearing, peaceful farmers. The only measure you have of the quality, the good quality of people's commerce with the divine is the way they behave, is their actual activity in the world. So the Quakers find, after these people come in and they make themselves into, quote, American farmers, unquote, that they have been right. And theoretically, the Quakers will admit into the colony Catholics, Jews, and even followers of Islam. In addition to being tolerant in the context of the 18th century, the Quakers are also non-hierarchical, and this is something else that Professor Tully has stressed. There's a kind of, it'd certainly be wrong to dismiss social hierarchy in the colony and among Quakers, but there is still a kind of leveling effect because no one can gainsay my connection to the transcendent over against his. And somehow we're all put more or less at the same level for the Quakers. Now, contrast that spirituality to what is on offer in Boston, Massachusetts, and New England. And here I'm talking about the Puritans, or as I prefer to call them, American Calvinists. The American Calvinists are nothing if not creedal, doctrinal, conceptual, intellectual followers of religion, which is based on correct belief. The Calvinists have in mind this grand schema of abstract beliefs about the way the world has to be if the way they interpret the Bible is true. And from this grand schema of beliefs, they make deductions about the sacraments, holy baptism and the Eucharist, about the giving of grace, about the conversion process, about the perseverance of the saints, and any number of other doctrinal issues. They're also intolerant. If you don't more or less believe what they believe, you're asked to leave. And finally, they are hierarchical. What's important for Calvinists is the connection of ministerial students to ministerial mentors. Among the ministers themselves, their connection to, in the larger towns, with a wider group of ministers, and then finally their connection to a wide association of ministers across New England. And my favorite line of this talk, and you might want to take this down, I like it anyway. It matters in New England if you're an old Calvinist, an Edwardian, a Hopkintonian, or an Emmonsite. It matters. Now, my first punchline here is that in the 18th century, Quaker spirituality sustains, undergirds, promotes the applied natural philosophy that's dominant in Philadelphia. The basic aspect of applied natural philosophy is that it's based on observation and taxonomy and observation. That's what's crucial to Quaker religiosity, some kind of direct experience. There's a kind of naive empiricism which is apparent in the culture of Quaker Philadelphia and in the dominant paradigm for intellectual culture. For Quaker grandees, the study, gardening and horticulture are socially acceptable, unostentatious ways of worshiping your God. The way in which the applied natural philosophers want to cash out their work in what they consider to be benevolent, benevolent consequences of their kind of investigation, that's consonant with the Quaker notion that the only measure we have for understanding the quality of people's interaction with their God is the way things work out in actual experience, the consequences of your religiosity. It is not accidental, and I don't mean to be a Marxist here, it is not accidental that Ben Franklin leaves Boston for Philadelphia. He says explicitly, Calvinist theology is cloying, is constricting for someone like him. And he has a dim but correct understanding that but somebody of his talents will be able to rise in Philadelphia and not in Boston. So, first, as I said, the first punchline is that what's going on and what makes Philadelphia an intellectual leader is consonant with the wider spiritual culture of Pennsylvania. Now, what happens in the 19th century to change that? There is an enormous revolution in knowledge and in the structure of science in the 19th century. Historians of science and philosophers of science will tell you that it is the development of the hypothetico-deductive method in science. What they mean by that is this, that observation is still important to scientists and to observers of nature and to the learned. But what is of equal importance are the creative powers of the human mind. What happens when scientists work is that they devise grand schemas for the way the world has to be. That's the hypothetical part of this hypothetico-deductive method. And then they deduce from their grand overall schema a whole set of consequences about the way the world must be, more specifically, which culminate in the creation of an experimental situation where the scientist puts nature to the test, puts nature to the question, devises a way to get certain results under certain standard conditions. And when you do that and your results are confirmed, then up the chain of inferences, there's a whole corroboration effect going on. If your experiment turns out differently from the way you think, if your results are falsified, similarly up the chain of inferences, the the structure of your worldview has to be altered. And the best example, and all these this is very conventional, all these philosophers of science and historians of science will tell you of the growth of the deductive method, the hypothetico-deductive method in the production of knowledge, and specifically in the sciences, is the growth of evolutionary biology. Darwin is certainly a very careful observer. But what is most important about Darwin is that this guy is a creative speculator of the highest order. He devises ideas about the way the world was millions and millions and millions of years ago, long before there were any human beings around to observe anything. From these deductions, or from this grand schema, he makes a series of deductions about the way the world has to be, and he tests them out with earthworms, with fruit flies, with some plants, and with a little tinkering of what he's about with the fossil record itself. Now, this is the second punchline, although I hope you can see it coming at this point. It's clear to me that the intellectual preconceptions that are prevalent in Boston support and sustain this new Euro-American paradigm of learning, much more so than the naive empiricism which is on offer in Philadelphia. Again, I would say, yeah.
Could I just say, so essentially we're sort of creating like an orthodoxy of science, which goes hand in hand with the orthodoxy of religion.
Yes,
okay.
Exactly right, yes. It is not accidental that the debate over Darwin in the United States takes place in Boston and not in Philadelphia, and that the leading American Darwinian is Asa Gray, a Harvard naturalist. Now, there are also changes in what I would call the organization of science. I'm concentrating on science. I should say learning all the time. There is a change in the organization of learning and science in the 19th century also. It becomes more hierarchical. It is no longer the case that the paradigm of learning is a bunch of gentlemen like Franklin sitting around a fire discussing stuff. It is rather that learning takes place in a structured hierarchical environment where you have pupils, tutors, you should know that, pupils, tutors, lecturers, assistants, and professors. And you work your way up the hierarchy. And if you don't, too bad for you. In fact, in the most developed fields of learning, in the hard sciences, the structure of the laboratory is really extraordinary in this respect. For the people who do the observing are the people with least experience, the students. And presiding over them are the people who have next least experience, the lab assistants. The professor is off in his own private office. He never sees this actual scut work. What he sees are some written results, and then he sits and thinks about how to create another experiment which will happen to advance his research project. All right. The change in the hierarchical nature of learning assists Boston more than Philadelphia. Now, there's a final aspect of this transformation which gives Boston its edge over Philadelphia that I want to consider, and which leads us, I think, closest to what's going on here. And that last consideration is this. I'm sure you will know, as U.S. history teachers, that in the 19th century, what I call a Protestant counter-revolution takes place in America. Its culture-wide phenomenon is the Second Great Awakening, which is a nationwide series of revivals that takes place in the 1820s, 30s, 40s. It gets called the Second Great Awakening because when it occurs, people look back to a more local set of revivals, mainly in the state of Connecticut, which then come to be called the First Great Awakening. And although it's parenthetical to my own interest in this talk, it's certainly, I think, really connected to what the theme of this weekend is. The major for me, the major unanswered and really significant question that confronts American history in the 18th century is how on earth did the Declaration and the Constitution get written at all? The last part of the 18th century is not just intensely political, which it is, but it's also, in comparison to the rest of American history, really detached from sectarian Protestantism. Some of these guys wouldn't call themselves Christians at all. Even those who do call themselves Christians dissociate themselves from sectarian Protestantism. This country has been Protestant since from the time the Pilgrims, stepped on that rock up until about 5 years ago. That's a joke, folks. Come on. Jesus. God. So this parenthetical question for me is how did this Enlightenment period arise in the first place? At any rate, it arises and it vanishes by the Second Great Awakening. So the overall thing that I would say happens is that Boston is going to benefit from the re-Protestantization of America at the expense of Philadelphia. But there is a much more specific aspect to that Protestant counter-revolution, which I want to end with. When, as a symbol, a token of this re-Protestantization, Harvard College develops a divinity school. It starts 1799, actually, and it's in place by 1815, 1816. And it's one of the affiliated schools which stamp Harvard as a true university as opposed to just being Harvard College. The University of Pennsylvania never has a divinity school. It becomes the nation's first it becomes the colony's first university in the late 1760s when it amalgamates to itself Pennsylvania Hospital. And then it has a medical school, which makes it a university. Now, when Harvard establishes its D school, it doesn't mean that they stop studying religion at Harvard College. It's rather that religion is, well, I have to explain it, but religion is somehow indirectly studied there. What happens at Harvard College is that the traditional classical curriculum is enlarged. It's no longer just Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. It also comes to include ancient history, philology as the study of language and its origins, and ultimately of literature. Now, why do we study these things? We study them at Harvard because they are the subjects which will allow the human intellect unaided by revelation to get us closest to the transcendent. We'll never get there, but what Harvard College can do now is to prepare people for true religion, because this collection of studies is the best the unaided intellect can do. They come to be called at Harvard the humanities. Now, why do we study the humanities? We study them because they're the things that make us truly human. But that means that they prepare us for the otherworldly. Being human has nothing to do with the here and now. What it means is you're waiting for the divine. We study these things not because they're useful, not because they're utilitarian, but precisely the opposite. Because they can help us make money. They can help us improve the world, which is a fruitless task anyway. We study them because they are not useful. So not all of a sudden, but over a period of 20 or 30 years, this great utilitarian ethos of Philadelphia is finally tainted by the secular. And I will, as a part of my, what do you call that, peroration, something like that. What is the best fantastic example of this? In 1881, the University of Pennsylvania establishes the first business school in the United States, the Wharton School of Commerce. And what 100 years before would have been regarded as the best thing going is now tarred by the brush of the secular, the worldly, the nasty, the money-grubbing. So just to conclude, in a couple of sentences, let me say the direct experiential religiosity of Quaker Philadelphia and its detachment from doctrinal Protestantism supports Philadelphia's leadership in the 18th century. When the structure of learning changes in the 19th century, what had been a support for Philadelphia becomes a detriment, and the more intellectual, religiously driven culture of Boston benefits. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll take questions. We ask you to wait for the microphone because this is being live streamed, and the web audience will not hear you unless you're speaking into the microphone.
They probably can't see me if I walk down there, right? Good. That's where I'm going. Yeah.
So we've heard a lot about Ben Franklin and how he's kind of central to a lot of what goes on in Pennsylvania. And you mentioned that he didn't feel like his ideas were sort of welcome, or he couldn't get very far in Massachusetts. But if he's so divergent from the Puritan views, like how was he able to spend the first, I don't know, 20 years of his life in Puritan culture, and then, I mean, isn't he a Protestant of that Puritan culture?
Good question. First, Franklin leaves Boston when he's 16, right? And he's basically on the run for a couple of years before that. It's certainly true that if you step back, the colonies are all products of Reformation Europe, so they all look more or less the same. I would argue with Professor Tully that there is a difference among all of these various colonies. Franklin is peculiar. He was always peculiar in Boston. It's one of the reasons. I mean, he doesn't imbibe he certainly imbibes part of it, but he's enough of a rebel, I think, so that it's a real issue for him to get out. Now, there is a large, as you can imagine, literature on Franklin. The most famous piece, actually, is by, there's a guy, Max Weber, the sociologist in The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, uses Franklin as an example of the Puritan, right? And there's, I would say that I love Weber, but he just goes completely astray in doing this. Franklin, Franklin is a roue. All the stuff he writes in his autobiography about, early to bed, early to rise, it's BS. He's not like that at all. He's a much more loosey-goosey guy who is not the Norman Vincent Peale, not the glad-hander that you might think he is, but he's not. It doesn't fit that stereotype of the Puritan, of somebody who's works 16 hours a day and is very abstemious and very moralistic about. He's just not like that at all. In fact, just to finish my answer, when he goes to France and he's working with John Adams, who is from Boston, and Adams, although is not doctrinally Protestant, is someone who has absorbed all of these things. Adams, you ought to read the letters. They're terrific. Adams hates Franklin. And he says all the time, this guy is lazy, he's in bed, he's got all these women around him, I can't stand it. Adams is a good example of a guy who's absorbed that Boston culture, not Franklin. Yeah.
So can you talk about deism kind of coming in here and that piece of it, or the relationship to the Enlightenment, or whatever you might want to say about that?
Oh, I crossed the line here. I'm sorry. One of the things and that's not my job to tell these guys how to run their conference. One of the things I missed is some explicit talk here that would be about the religion of the founders, because this is a hot topic with a lot of, I think, religiously committed people trying to make too much of the Protestantism of the founders, kind of to get away from, you can't take this heroic period of American history and say, gee, they're not Protestant. A lot of people get upset about that. And it's certainly true that there are guys like Patrick Henry who did consider themselves Trinitarian Protestants and are very serious about it. But there's a large group of these people who are detached from doctrinal Protestantism in two ways. At the extreme is someone like Franklin, who considers himself a deist. That is to say, he believes there is this God or some kind of godlike presence in the background of the universe, which makes sense of it. And this godlike presence has ordered this world in a way that makes it sensible, reasonable, and in which you can predictably expect somehow good results because this God is good. There's no further religiosity than that. I think Jefferson, to some extent, really shares those views. So that's one group of people, detached. They're the furthest. Then there are a whole bunch of other guys who would, if you asked them, are you a Christian or a Protestant, they would say yes. But they don't care about it, really. What they see is that Protestant religion is useful for social control. That is, it's good to have all the people believing these things because otherwise they might be killing one another or shooting one another. They have a common culture which will energize them. But if you ask them, do you believe these doctrines of European Calvinism or Protestantism, they wouldn't care about them. And I would include George Washington is the best example for me because he's such a proper guy that he would never in public ever denigrate religion. But in his own life, what's going on? This is, I'm glad my slaves have this because they're not going to, do anything bad. And I think I think Adams is like that. I think Madison. So that's how deism fits in. It's one part, and I think it's the most extreme part of these guys' detachment from creedal religiosity. For me, the more important issue is where did it come from? I would actually, I know Wally, you've thought about this, and anyone else, I would like to talk about that. Where did the Enlightenment in America come from? How did it arise out of this intensely Protestant culture? Yeah.
The influence of the Enlightenment thinkers crossing the ocean.
Yeah,
over.
of course, of course. I mean, that's what
Yeah,
Franklin and
Jefferson
Madison
and
Jefferson, they all
Madison,
buy
they
into
buy
that.
it, yeah.
But why?
I mean, why do they buy into
yeah,
it,
why
or
do
why
they
did
buy
it
into
start
it?
in France?
Why isn't the revolution and the constitutional periods, I mean, I can understand them occurring, but why aren't they much more heavily Protestant, doctrinally Protestant? Why is Calvinism kind of pushed to the side? In every other, here's a great example, Civil War, right? Abraham Lincoln, the greatest American who will ever live, turns out by the end of the war to be a full-fledged believing Calvinist. Why do these guys not pick up on that whole heritage? What has them take a different route?
Here's the possible question to answer your question. Why can't you argue that the Enlightenment was far more Christian than either its supporters or detractors argued? In fact, this is something.
You know why? Because it wasn't.
Well, you and I really disagree about this, and John Pocock and Alan Corsi now is getting honorary degrees and getting honored at Catholic universities, and you and Walter have both known Alan a long time. I mean, that's quite a change. I think it's, I mean, and a lot of Enlightenment historians have shown a lot of the leaders of the Enlightenment were Christians, or like David Hume, did have a keen sense of original sin. How about that?
Wait, David Hume? Voltaire? Look, all right, let me put it like this. Yes, in some way, Christian Europe is enormously important in the development of European intellectual life. But there are some times and places where it is diminished for one reason or another. The greatest period of its diminishment is this period of the Enlightenment, and I don't think we've explained it.
Okay, Bruce, your evident public confusion and
What?
is confusing us. You're supposed to be the expert. You're supposed to tell us these questions.
What?
You're not supposed to belabor the fact that we don't know this. I can't believe it. I mean, the Enlightenment that influences most Americans, almost all Americans, is the Scottish Enlightenment, the English Enlightenment. And that's perfectly compatible with one or another form of latitudinarian Christianity. But George Washington was exactly what you would expect. He was a mid-18th century low church Episcopalian. And he would have been perfectly comfortable with that. But the point is this: the people, like, I did not design this conference, but I will defend this conference insofar as the founders in Philadelphia had a certain anthropology.
This is the way you succeed in teaching. You stick it to people and they respond. Go on, Wally.
Well, the founders had a remarkable consensus on human anthropology. I mean, their creedal, positions may have been all over the map. And they may not, frankly, have cared very much about their creedal positions in many cases. But they all agreed that human beings are not angels. If men were angels, said James Madison, we wouldn't need a government. And if angels governed us, we wouldn't have to worry about it. Instead, we got a problem here. We're human beings. We're fallen creatures, or we are imperfect creatures, or we are imperfectible creatures, however you want to call it.
I think
then
that's related to
the
original sin. Is that
well,
the
yeah, but it doesn't have to be. It's an understanding of human beings as imperfect. We're somewhere between the angels and the beasts.
Now, I would say, Wally, that's a great part of what's going on with those guys, and I understand. Believe me, I appreciate that what you've said. At the same time, there is, as you know, and this is the wrong word for my argument, a messianic. I mean, these guys.
Okay. Let's mix that into the equation. That's very good, Bruce. Very good. We have some very pragmatic late 18th century philosopher politicians who were sitting down to design a frame of government on the basis of an understanding of human nature that is not at all utopian, that is quite pragmatic. But we still have this millenarian streak. Oh my, where does that come from? Well, I'm not going to suggest where it comes from. You can tell me. You wrote the book on Jonathan Edwards, but this all gets mixed up into something called civil religion.
Yeah, I wouldn't deny
The millenarianism gets secularized in a way that immanentizes the eschaton, et cetera, et cetera. And that is the quirk in this country. William Appleton Williams said there's a quirk in our theology, in our American theology, and that explains everything. Well, William Appleton Williams may have been wrong about everything else, but I think he got that right.
Let me make two comments. First, I'm not quite sure that it is the Scottish Enlightenment that is so important. I mean, they don't like Hume at all. Hume is far, far too radical for these people. He's somebody they keep away from. I do think they were heavily enamored by the French. I don't think. Well, I guess my model is always Franklin. But that's all right. All right, that's one thing. The other thing is I don't want to deny this, the imposition of this kind of Protestant. There's an overriding set of Protestant ideas, which actually are really diminished though by the Quakers, who are really extraordinary. But at the same time, the creedal, doctrinal belief aspects of American religiosity, of American Protestantism, just vanish for these guys. And that's what puzzles me. Where did it go? Because all of these guys are, they're saturated in it. It didn't go away for, how would you explain the difference between somebody like Lincoln and the founders? Why does he go for that gold that's Calvinism? And why do these guys, there's something different that's important that needs to be explained.
We'll take one more question.
If Philadelphia and the intellectual atmosphere there gives rise to the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, can you point to issues of governance or politics that can be attributed to Boston's influence?
What? Wally said ordered liberty. No. No, I can't think of any. Boston is in hothouse of theological beliefs, and where the kind of as you know this, the radicals in the revolution come from Boston, intensely extremist in some way, but I don't know where I don't know where they come from either.
Would you attribute manifest destiny?
Or could the quirk be as simple as borrowing from the indigenous people that existed here in the first place? That, in other words, are we looking at it from a European sort of provincial perspective? What have we borrowed from the indigenous people that we took the land from their political philosophies, who we were exposed to? Are we completely dismissive of these people and this land that we inherited or that we took?
Yes, I would say get real. They really didn't care about the Indians. Insofar as they're going to push them out of the way where they were going.
I would say it's naive to say that we didn't borrow anything from these people. At the very least, we took their land.
Well, yeah, that's not borrowing, it's taking.
There was still a culture in place that existed here. There's still a culture that existed that was in place here, and it's dismissive, or it's a completely European conceit to just say these people
you know, their culture had no influence whatsoever.
Well, what would you say the influence was?
I don't know. I'm asking a question like yourself. I'm a teacher, so I ask questions. You're looking for, you know, there's something that's bugging you. I'm trying to ask questions as well.
All right. Yeah. I don't.
To dovetail, and I'm an English teacher, so I'm not as steeped in this as you are. Well, I'm assuming that. What the Iroquois League, wasn't that Franklin's basis for the way the government would be divided, or not divided, but structured?
What? Wait.
When you're talking about what did we get from the natives, I thought that the Iroquois League was one of the bases for our government. Well,
Say again. What's the basis?
in that they're being self-governing, like the states, but then unified.
I don't think that comes from. No, you mean like the more or less confederated aspects of Native American life.
Mm-hmm.
No, I don't think that's where it comes from. I mean, there's too many more obvious candidates that just leap out at you when you know first of all, the colonies are established as separate colonies. So what they have to work with right from the start is something that the Europeans have imposed on them. And you know, when they get together, they have to overcome the actual existence for a couple of hundred years of colonies in the New World that they inhabit, in which are separate political entities.
I think we're going to have to bring this session to a close. Thank you very much, Professor Kuklik.